very pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Hunt this morning for our grand round. So I first met Dr. Hunt on the Council of Education for the CAP, where she was the chair, and I was and still am a member, actually. Dr. Hunt did for her anatomic pathology and molecular genetic pathology fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. And she's held a variety of leadership positions over the year at the University of Pittsburgh, Cleveland Clinic, Massachusetts General. She was chair at the University of Arkansas for 5 years and recently moved to be the chair at the University of Florida College of Medicine. She's been very active in national societies. She served as the president of the Association of Molecular Pathologists. She served on multiple CAP committees, including chair and vice chair roles. She has over 150 peer-reviewed publications, many with a focus on head and neck and endocrine system pathology, including molecular genetic biomarkers. She also has a great interest in promoting leadership, and in particular promoting women in leadership and teaching self-confidence and ways to control imposter syndrome. She's given multiple lectures regionally and nationally on this topic. She's developed an experiential leadership position for faculty, a leadership development program for medical students, and a virtual coaching CME program for women physicians, which has had more than 140 graduates. In addition, she provides executive leadership coaching for emerging women leaders and has published a book in the popular press called Unlocking Your Authentic Self, Overcoming Imposter Syndrome, Enhancing Self-Confidence, and Banishing Self-Doubt, which is essentially what she's going to be talking to us about today. So I'm very excited to have her come speak with us. And thank you, Dr. Hunt, for coming.
And thank you all for inviting me. I'm so glad that we can be together today. I wish we could be live. I do wish we could be live, but I'm pretty happy that I can still interact with people and still be able to be part of your group today. So it's nice that we can be virtual, even though we all prefer to be live. So that's what I'm talking about. There will not be a single histology slide here. There will not be any molecular slides. There will be nothing about pathology today. Well, mostly nothing. We will be talking instead about something that I have gotten tremendously interested in the past couple of years and have really honed in on speaking about, because I think it's so important for women in leadership, but also for men in medicine to know about as well. And as we go through here today, I'll give you a lot of statistics, I'll show you a lot of information, but really what I want you to come away with are some practical tools that you can take and use for yourself. So we will be doing a lot of different things today, and I will give you a lot of information. But in the end, what I really want you to walk away with is something that you can take home and act upon for yourself. So that will be my major intention and goal for today's lecture. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I care so much about imposter syndrome and why it's become so important to me as I think about my desire and agenda, really, to increase the number of women in leadership. I will also give you an overview of what imposter syndrome is and, importantly, what it is not. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I will briefly touch on why I think it's affecting people's careers. And then lastly, again, I'm going to leave you with some really practical, easy to use tools. I call them tools to make and take space. And you'll see as we go through that second part about the tools, what I'm talking about and how really this is a story of self-empowerment and how we can use these tools to improve empowerment, overcome self-confidence gaps, and to decrease self-doubt. So that'll be the agenda and the goals. Now, I do want to tell you this is going to be a lot different than most of your grand rounds. You've probably already figured that out, because most grand rounds in pathology they have pictures, or they at least have scans, or they have research in them, and this will not have any of that. So maybe already you know it's different, but let me tell you, it's going to be even more different than you thought. And here is why. Because I hate webinars. And these sessions, like, I can't see a single person. All I see are your names. I can't see your faces. And these sessions are, it's really easy for you to attend passively. So what I would like to tell you is that you will get so much more of that out of this today if you make a commitment right now to attend actively. And this is what I call attending my holograminar. And what I mean by that is this is not just a webinar. I want you to transport yourself into the room with me. So let's just pretend, let's just suspend judgment, and we'll pretend for the next hour that we are together, that we're in a room, we're sitting at round tables, and I'm walking around and we're interacting with each other, and we're doing the exercises together, and we're learning and growing together. So transport yourself into this today. Be present with me today. I have a couple of different points where I'm going to ask you to really reflect. Get out a piece of paper, do the exercises. I promise you that you will get a lot more out of it if you actually do that, and if you put yourself into the moment today with me. So join me today in this holograminar, and I think you'll get a lot out of it and learn a lot. So we're going to start right away with this self-reflection. So I'm going to give you just about 30 seconds here to consider, and go ahead and get a piece of paper out and just write down for yourself. But you don't have to share this, by the way. This is not, there's no group sharing here. So you can really be honest, and you can really put it down on paper. What is the highest career level that or rank that you expect to reach in your career? So 30 seconds. Okay, so now I bet if I could see your faces right now, some of you would have written something down and looked up. Many of you are still looking down and still thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know, I can't write this down. So there are a significant number of the people in this room today. We have 71 people on this session, and I'm going to guess at least half of you felt a little twinge of something you did not like when you wrote that down. At least half of you thought, oh, that doesn't feel good. I don't really like saying that. I don't really like writing that down. It feels like maybe it's arrogant or bragging, or maybe I don't feel very humble when I write that down. It feels almost presumptuous. Some people might feel like it's grandiose or too ambitious. Or if you want to go here, that, you know, it's aggressive or pretentious to be writing down this big goal or this aspiration. And that's common. I mean, when I do this exercise with people, that's what people say out loud. If we were in a room and I had you write it down and I had you share it with somebody else, you would feel even more uncomfortable. Or if I asked you to put it in the chat, you would have probably felt very uncomfortable with that. And that's actually really, really common. Some of you didn't feel that at all. Some of you felt fine writing it down, and you felt like it was just a fact or just another thing that you would write down about yourself. But, you know, I think it's really important to think about that, and to think about those of us who were feeling that little twinge of something. What if instead you were feeling no twinge, and instead you felt like that was just standard forecasting, strategic planning, just preparing for my future, maybe a visualization exercise that gets you somewhere that you didn't know you could get. Or the last one is the one I love the most, and this is this concept of manifestation. A lot of people are talking about this idea of manifestation. If I write it down and I say it out loud, is it more likely to come true? So what if instead of feeling like that was twingy and braggy and arrogant to write something down like that, what if instead you felt like it was living into your own self-empowerment? And that's what we are going to focus on today. We're going to really focus on that twinge and moving it into a feeling of more self-empowerment and strength behind that. And, you know, it's interesting. Why is it so difficult for some of us to speak those goals out loud without getting that little element of distaste? Why is it so difficult to step into personal power without feeling like you need to apologize for it? And why is it so difficult to appreciate your own skills and talents without a lot of caveats after it? And those are all questions that we wrestle with. And they're all questions that are really very related to this concept of imposter syndrome. I like to think of imposter syndrome as a mismatch between what we see as we look inward and what other people see as they look outward. So as someone looks at you and they say, wow, this is a superstar, internally, imposter syndrome, or people with imposter syndrome, are not seeing that superstar. So in many ways, I use the metaphor for imposter syndrome of poor vision, because it really is poor vision around yourself. It's like, I don't see what other people see in me. And that is really a classic description of what imposter syndrome is. Now, we're going to get into a lot more detail about what imposter syndrome is, but I just like to set that stage with a personal feeling of maybe you can see, or maybe you can experience bumping up against imposter syndrome with that little exercise in self-reflection. We'll get more into it and do more detail as we go into today. So I promised you I would tell you why I care about this. So let me first set the stage about why I care so much about imposter syndrome. The main reason I care about imposter syndrome comes from these statistics. Women make up about 80% of the healthcare workforce, and they make up less than 20% of leadership. So 13% of hospital CEOs, 19% of hospital chiefs, 18% of department chairs and deans are women. And our numbers have not increased substantially over the past 20 years. There's a slight increase, and I'll show it to you in a minute, but largely they're not too different than they were 20 years ago. At the same time, there are plenty of data, plenty of studies, plenty of literature, plenty of papers out there that show that diverse leadership, including all diversity, but there are many that show women in particular, will yield better results. And that includes better financial performance. It includes better quality and safety results in the hospital setting. It includes better patient and better employee engagement across the board. And so while we have poor diversity, we know that good diversity increases our performance. And so it is a major goal for me, and it's a major agenda for me to work towards improving gender diversity and shrinking that gender leadership gap in healthcare. And as I started thinking about this and working with women, aspiring leaders and emerging leaders in coaching, over and over again, I came to the conclusion that there are many drivers holding women back, but one of them is an internal driver, and one of them is that imposter syndrome driver. And so that is really why I got into this work. I do just want to share these statistics with you so that you can see them. This is vice chairs, chairs, and deans. Percentage of women is shown here over multiple decades. And you can see that, I mean, it does increase, but look at the scale. We're only at 25%. So it's increasing at a very, very slow rate. Now, you will hear over and over again, you'll hear, oh yeah, but we have a pipeline problem. This is the classic argument. Yes, we have a pipeline problem. So we don't have women coming into the leadership system, and that's why we don't have a lot of women in leadership. And, 20 years ago, this argument was true. So 20 years ago, we really didn't have as many women in the system, and we didn't really have as many women going into medicine. But in the last 20 years, it's just not true anymore. So it is just not true that we don't have enough women coming into medicine. In fact, for almost the last 2 decades, we've had almost equal numbers of men and women coming into medical school. So if you just assume that it takes, what you could say 15 years to become a chair, then let's go back to 2008, and you can see that 50%, almost 50% of medical students were women. So if all things were equal, and if we truly had no pipeline problem or no problem with our leadership trajectory, then we would have 50% women in leadership right now, because it would be equal, right? It would be equal to the pipeline. So we don't have a pipeline problem per se. We have a flow through the pipeline problem, and women are not progressing to leadership, but they certainly are entering into the pipeline. So some people call that a leaky pipeline. I think there's more to it than leak. I think there's a lot more to it. And I think there's actually a lot of drivers that are keeping women out of leadership positions. So what are some of those drivers? Some of those drivers are major external drivers, and those are quite important. And I am not talking about these today. I could do a whole lecture on these external drivers, and I have. However, we're not going to discuss these today. Today, we're going to be talking about those inside personal factors. I do want to put these on the table, though, because these are absolutely crucial, absolutely important. So there are obvious, noticeable actions and inactions that keep women out of leadership. There are microaggressions. There is gender bias. There is discrimination. There is unconscious bias. All of these things are factors that are impeding women from being in leadership positions in equal numbers to men. No question. Plenty of literature, plenty of studies, obvious factors. And we are all responsible for those. So each one of us should be taking action in our own way to address these societal factors. There's no question they're important for us to address. And there's really no question that we can't get to equality and leadership if we don't address these things. I do just want to talk for 1 minute about a subtle tilt, just to give you an example. It's really just one of many, but I wanted to show it as just one little example of a subtle tilt that gives you a sense of how these factors from the outside can be impacting women in leadership in very indirect and subtle ways. But then we're going to jump right into talking about those inside personal factors, the ones that come from within. And we're really going to focus almost entirely on imposter syndrome for that. So, subtle tilt. This is interesting, and it's a fact. And it actually really relates to imposter syndrome. So one subtle tilt is that women tend to pre-eliminate themselves from jobs. And what this means is that pools of applicants are skewed towards men because women eliminate themselves before they even apply. And one of the classic descriptions of this is from a study from industry, where they showed that men will apply for a job if they meet 60% of the job criteria, and women will apply for the job only when they meet 100% of the job criteria. So what this means is that you can tilt your applicant pool based on how you write job ads. So if you write a job ad that looks like this, because you want a new chair of a pathology department, and it has this long list of very substantial criteria, our new chair will do all of these amazing things. Even if you really truly want this person, this magical, mystical person who has all of these characteristics, then if you write this in your job ad, you will absolutely skew the pool towards men, because women will look at this and say, oh, look, I only meet 60% of the qualifications, I'm not applying. And men will look at this and say, oh, yeah, I'm pretty good. I meet most of those. That's good. I'll apply. So this is a subtle tilt where you will skew things if you write your job ads with something like this. And it's an example of how the societal factors and the internal imposter syndrome factors are kind of intermingling there and coming together, because obviously there's a societal impact here, but there is also a personal part of this, and a personal part of living into self-empowerment that women do need to benefit from. And they do need to recognize, and they do need to say to themselves, look, I meet 60% of the job criteria and qualifications. I will be bold, I will be empowered, and I will apply. And that's where we can see that we have a part in it personally, and we have a part in it at the leadership level and at the society level. And they both come together, and they're both important. If we want to change this vision, if we want to change this poor vision or this mismatch between what the person sees and what the outside world sees. So now we're going to move into talking more about that person side, the imposter syndrome, and how it impacts people and how it shows up for people. And then again, as I promised, we're going to do some work around this, and we're going to have some time to look at some of these tools. But let's start with what it is. What is imposter syndrome? You know, in some ways, I feel like imposter syndrome is almost like a buzzword. It's kind of the word du jour, and it's very popular right now to talk about imposter syndrome. It's all over the internet. It's in social media. You can find all kinds of blogs on how to overcome imposter syndrome and how to recognize it and all of these things. I mean, it's just absolutely everywhere. But let's talk about the basics. So we're going to go back decades to the 1970s when it was first described. And it was first described as imposter phenomenon, by the way. And Pauline Clance and her colleague Imes, I can't remember Imes' first name, but Clance and Imes wrote about imposter phenomenon in a journal. And they wrote about it having described it from Pauline Clance's psychotherapy practice, where she worked with high-achieving women. And she was discovering this phenomenon where these high-achieving women had this experience of self-perceived intellectual phoniness, this fake or fraud syndrome, this feeling that they didn't belong, that they didn't deserve what they had gotten, and that they had really arrived here by luck or chance. And probably most people in this audience today have had an experience like that. I mean, I definitely remember sitting in my first day of medical school class in this big auditorium, you know, with all these people sitting sitting on the rows that were kind of stepped down from the steep auditorium. And I remember the dean getting up there and saying, "You have an Olympic gold medalist in your midst. You have a concert pianist who played at Carnegie Hall," and went on and on. And I'm thinking, I think I got the wrong letter. I am pretty sure I should not be in this class. And I bet you if we did a hand raise poll right now, many of you had an experience like that where you felt in whatever setting, maybe it was medical school, maybe it was graduate school, maybe it was some kind of program that you were in, you've had an experience of feeling like a fake or a fraud, like you didn't quite belong. You looked around and thought, oh, these people are much better than me. Most of us have had an experience like that. Now, what I want to comment on, though, is that this self-perceived intellectual phoniness or fake or fraud is really not the whole story of imposter syndrome. And my experience working with lots and lots of people who have imposter syndrome and who have overcome it, or at least worked to learn some tools to control it for themselves, there's a lot more to it. And in the end, I believe that imposter syndrome is really much more about appreciating yourself, recognizing and valuing your own skills and talents as much as the outside world does. So it's actually matching the external world with the internal world view of yourself that is the key to overcoming imposter syndromes. It's not about getting rid of the perception that you're a fake or a fraud. It's about elevating your self-appreciation to a level that you can truly appreciate what you bring to the world, your value, what you bring to any setting and to any table. Now, at the same time, in imposter syndrome, where there's this mismatch between your perception of your skills and talents and what the outside world sees, in true pervasive imposter syndrome that is debilitating, that false perception also changes your behaviors, your decisions, and your actions. So let me give you an example. I worked with a person a couple of years ago that was described, she was in practice, but she described being a senior resident and really wanting to apply for a high-powered, really interesting fellowship. And she said, I thought about it and I realized I wasn't competitive. And I looked at these programs and I said, they would never take me. I'm just from this little place in the middle of nowhere. There's no chance. I don't have a chance to get in. They'll never take me. I'm not qualified. I'm not good enough. I'm not going to even apply. And she didn't. She didn't apply. So that is true imposter syndrome. That is pervasive, debilitating imposter syndrome. Now, some of you can relate a little bit to that. And you go, yeah, I've totally thought that. I can't apply for that job. I'm not ready for that job. I can't apply for that fellowship. But you did anyway. And that is relatively normal. So that's not exactly the same thing when you actually just pull your bootstraps up and you go, yep, okay, I don't feel good about it, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's kind of at the place where you have those self-doubt moments, but you overcome them and you can move on and you don't have it guide your perceptions, your decisions, and your behaviors. And so that's kind of a value decision, a value perspective there on imposter syndrome. There's the really bad, pervasive, debilitating kind, and then there's kind of the everyday kind that you kind of just experience here and there, and you need to remember and you need to use some tools to kind of pull those bootstraps up and go, yep, I'm going to do it anyway. So we do need to also recognize that spectrum as well. However, in a lot of imposter syndrome cases, or a lot of people with imposter syndrome, there's a lot more to it than just being a career derailer. So it's not just about the person who didn't apply for that high-powered fellowship because they were too afraid or they didn't believe in themselves. There's also a lot of other underlying negative aspects to it. So this graph over here is a graph from those 150, actually probably 150 now women who have gone through my program. And this is an interesting graph because it shows the level of imposter syndrome with the level of burnout. Now you'll see that it's definitely related to each other, but what's also interesting is that these data are pre and post program data. So what you see with working on imposter syndrome is that burnout goes down and imposter syndrome goes down as you work on it. So as you work on imposter syndrome, burnout and the level of imposter syndrome go down. So those data are mixed in there. I should actually do them in different color dots. That would be really interesting, the way to show it. But it's clear that imposter syndrome is related to negative things. It's related to burnout, and not just from my work, but from lots of other people's work as well. It's also related to dissatisfaction with life, low optimism, unhappiness, career dissatisfaction. So just a lot of negative drainers associated with imposter syndrome. And when we work on imposter syndrome, we see these things get better. So when you, for example, through my program, when people went through it and they really focused in on learning tools and skills to overcome imposter syndrome, incidentally, their optimism and happiness went up. And I mean, it's not incidental, it's all related, but we didn't work on happiness and we didn't work on optimism. We worked on imposter syndrome, and those things clearly got better for people. So it is more than just career derailer there. So I actually don't like the term imposter syndrome for a couple of reasons. One of them being that for me, it feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when we call, when we give it a name like syndrome, for one thing, it feels like a diagnosis. And the other part of that is that when we use the words imposter syndrome, I, in my medical brain, liken it to, say, a medical syndrome. So let's just say diabetes. So if you have diabetes, you are a diabetic. But if you go back to imposter syndrome, if you have imposter syndrome, you're not actually an imposter. Your brain is telling you you're one, but you're not actually one. So in many ways, I feel like that kind of reinforces itself. It's self-fulfilling in many ways. So what I like to use better is self-underappreciation syndrome. And probably it would be better as self-underappreciation phenomenon. But to be honest, I can never spell phenomenon. So I just keep it with syndrome just because it's easier for me. But self-underappreciation is the key here. So if you think about that, if you have self-underappreciation syndrome, you truly are a self-underappreciator. And that gives you something to act on. It gives you something to think about and to target and to work towards to become a better self-appreciator. And that's really what this is about. So in self-underappreciation syndrome, these are just some features that you would notice. Consistently feeling like you're not enough, not good enough, not strong enough, not beautiful enough, not fast enough, not whatever, not accomplished enough. It could be any enough, but not feeling like you are enough. Another feature that's classic is minimizing past accomplishments and successes. Another one is questioning other people's confidence in you. And this shows up all the time in the workplace. The people who have employees or who supervise other people in this audience would recognize this, where you give somebody a great new project and say, oh my gosh, I would love for you to do this project. You're so perfect for it. You have all the skills. It's just right for you. And the person goes, really? You think so? I'm not sure I can do that. And you're like, what? You are so skilled and talented. How could you not believe that about yourself? So it's that questioning, that mismatch between what other people think and what you think. And then the last one, pervasive feelings of self-doubt, is really a bad one. And this is not just like, ooh, I don't know if I can do that. This is like the resident who said, ooh, I can't do that fellowship and doesn't apply. So it's the pervasive, debilitating self-doubt that I'm talking about. It is important to differentiate that from healthy, self-protective self-doubt when you're starting something new. So the story I like to tell for this is somebody I coached multiple years ago who said, I really want to present at our national meeting. And this was not in pathology, she's in another specialty. And she was a relatively new in practice person. I think she'd been out of residency about a year. And we talked, and she said, but I have this imposter syndrome. I just don't think, it's imposter syndrome's keeping me from doing it. And I asked her if she'd ever presented anything before. Oh, no, I haven't done any presentations. I said, well, have you written any papers on this? No. Have you done any research on it? No. Have you done any practice in it? Are any of your patients in this? No, not really. And I looked at her and I said, you don't have imposter syndrome. You're just not ready. I mean, you just don't have any experience, and you can't be on the national stage if you don't have the experience and the chops to back it up. So you just need to wait a couple of years and do some things, and then you'll be ready. So we want to differentiate pervasive self-doubt and imposter syndrome from just those self-protective instincts that are actually good when you're doubting yourself because you actually don't have the skills and talents yet, and you're developing them, and that's a great place to be. So differentiating those can be important too. Now, I do want to come back to those external things, because the external things actually are huge amplifiers for people who have underlying self-doubt. So if there's a kernel of self-doubt of any kind in somebody, it can be absolutely magnified and even permanently installed in bad ways when it's combined with destructive forces. So if somebody has a little bit of self-doubt and they experience overt discrimination or racial bias, and they experience it in big, loud ways that come right at them in their face, or if they're experiencing constant, exhausting microaggressions against them, or if they're being marginalized and minimized, or if they're getting social cues of not belonging, their self-doubt becomes magnified and amplified in very destructive ways. So we also have to recognize the interplay with society and the internal imposter syndrome or self-doubt that can be there. We have a place on the Gulf, and my husband went out a couple of weeks ago and he sent me a picture, and it was like the whole yard was flooded. The water came up over the seawall into the yard. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And I texted the neighbor who's been there a long time, and she's like, oh no, this happens. It happens every once in a while when there's a really high tide and a storm and a full moon, and they all come together. And so I think of this kind of like that really high tide, right? So when all of those features come together and just kind of make it go really high, really flooded high tide, it's like this for the self-doubt. So the self-doubt started small, but when it's reinforced and magnified by these external destructive forces, then it becomes even more powerful and even worse. And so we just need to recognize that interplay. There's an interesting new article in Harvard Business Review that I find it very interesting. It's really well worth reading. I recommend reading it. And the title is Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And what it really is illustrating is that these external destructive forces of discrimination and bias, and especially against women of color, are really destructive, and it is absolutely true, and that we're labeling it as imposter syndrome, but it's actually societal pressure that's making this happen. It's this amplification of any kernel of self-doubt into this destructive self-doubt that's coming from that society level. And their premise is, look, let's stop talking about imposter syndrome and let's start talking about society and fixing it. I 100% agree we need to talk about society and fixing it. I don't 100% agree that we should stop talking about imposter syndrome. To me, this is like talking about the gender pay gap and saying to Dr. Firk and Dr. Hunt that we as chairs ought to be fixing the gender pay gap, and that it's a society problem and it's a leadership problem, not a woman problem. And we would both agree. We would both agree and say, yeah, we've got to fix the gender pay gap. But does that mean we don't teach women to negotiate better? No, what we need to do is both. We need to also teach women to negotiate, as well as fixing the society issues. And so the same is true with imposter syndrome. We need to be activists and we need to fix those society issues. At the same time, it is well worth working on the inside part. It's well worth spending time and becoming better at controlling our own imposter tendencies. So I just like to put that out there because this is new, really new, and it's been in a lot of the press, and it's a very, very interesting article to read. Now, I also like to point out that self-appreciation is a spectrum. I mean, it's not just one thing, but at the bottom of the spectrum down here is this self-underappreciation, or what we are calling imposter syndrome. And at the very top of the spectrum is a totally different effect, and that's what I lovingly call self-overappreciation. You know these people, you might call them something else, but this is also known in the literature as the Dunning-Kruger effect. These are the people who really have a lot of self-appreciation, and maybe the outside world doesn't agree so much with them. you might think of them as narcissists or arrogant or whatever. And in the middle is this healthy level. And that's what we're striving for. We're really striving for a healthy level of self-appreciation. And I always like to tell people who are worried about this, most people who have self-underappreciation are worried. They're worried that they're going to become arrogant if they work on this. And I can tell you without a doubt that you will not become arrogant. If you have self-underappreciation, then you will barely make it to healthy self-appreciation, and it'll be really hard to stay there. So never, ever worry about going to the other end of the spectrum. Just as somebody with self-over-appreciation will never drop to the bottom of the spectrum, they will have to struggle to go down to the healthy level. So either way, either place that you might be at, that you will want to strive to go to the middle. Now, this is also a good time to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome in our world, and just to point out that it's very, very common in medicine. And it's been estimated that about 70% of women in medicine have experienced self-underappreciation syndrome, and about 50% of men have. So you can see that a lot of people around us have this experience of self-underappreciation at some point in their career, and they've had it to the level where it was affecting their behaviors, decisions, and actions. So this is really prevalent. Now, the fact is, though, that 30% of women and 50% of men haven't experienced it. So now our audience is up to 85 people. So, a significant number of the people in here, not everybody, but a number, probably a third, maybe, let's just estimate, are looking at all of this going, yeah, no, not me. Not me. I don't really have it. I'm not going to worry about it. So what I want to do right now is just invite you to think about where you fit on this spectrum, and just invite yourself to just put yourself on there somewhere and think about you. And if you're at the bottom, then I would like you to listen to the rest of this for yourself. If you're in the middle or at the top, what I would like you to do, and I would invite you to do, is to recognize that you might be where you want to be, but people you love and care about might not be. And so I would invite you to engage in the rest of today listening for someone else. So you might be listening for a spouse, or perhaps a colleague, or perhaps one of your children. You might be listening on their behalf, because the tools that I'm going to give you today and talk to you about today can be something you can use with other people. It's a little tricky, but I'll give you a few hints. But certainly it is an awareness that you could bring to your relationships with others if you don't feel that you fall at the bottom of this spectrum. So please invite yourself to listen, either for yourself or for somebody else that you care about, because I think that you'll get a lot out of it, in the sense that you can take this home with you and use it for other people as well as for yourself. Okay, so let's get into some nitty-gritty about imposter syndrome. In all of my work and in all of my studies and coaching and programs that I've done, I've really identified and kind of boiled imposter syndrome down to what I call 5 tendencies of imposter syndrome. And these are very, very common. Now, interestingly, they're just common in general. If you don't have imposter syndrome, you can still have some of these, but they're really pervasive and powerful in imposter syndrome. So the 5 tendencies are these. First of all, a very powerful, mean, cruel, and nasty inner critic. And we're going to come back to the inner critic at the very end when we talk about one of the tools. Secondly, a really low ability to control emotional self-expression. And you might notice this in 2 different ways. In women, it often tends to be people with imposter syndrome tend to not react very well to emotionally charged situations, and will often cry when they don't want to cry. And so this really is an emotional self-expression issue. Another one is very overdone strengths that actually stray into self-sabotage. So people who, especially in imposter syndrome, people whose kindness, compassion, and caring becomes overdone to the point that it becomes people-pleasing and minimizing themselves. And so that's a very common one in imposter syndrome. And then this is really common in medicine in general. It's not always because of imposter syndrome, but it certainly is one that's very prevalent in imposter syndrome. And that is an unhealthy need or over striving for perfection. So perfectionism. And then lastly, in imposter syndrome, I see this over and over again, an inability to process criticism without kind of letting it affect your whole life, and dismissing praise. And so this is a really common one as well. We're not going to really go into depth on any of these today. We're going to touch on a few of them in multiple ways, but these are areas that people can work on if they have imposter syndrome. And actually, I've developed a new assessment. If anybody wants to take it, I'll send you the link to it, but it's also on my website. It's very easy to access if you want to take the assessment. So what the assessment does is it breaks it down into these 5 categories, and it gives people an idea of how prevalent that tendency is for them in their spectrum of imposter syndrome. And this is a heat map that I've created from hundreds, 600 or 700 people who have taken the survey, the assessment. And what it shows is that as imposter syndrome goes up to the right, the tendencies also get more pronounced. And so they do fit nicely with this imposter syndrome tendency. And by the way, the reason I know this is such an insult to pathologists to see a heat map in purple and or yellow, but I've decided that we shouldn't be showing red and green anymore. There's too many people who are colorblind. So I'm changing my heat maps to different colors so that people can all see them. So this is just an example of the data that comes out of that assessment. And I will send Sophia a link to it so she can distribute it if you want to. Okay, so remember the tendencies: metabolizing criticism, perfectionism, self-sabotage, and emotional self-control, and the inner critic. Now, I want to give you a moment to spend in reflection. So just some self-reflection. Which tendency of these resonates with you? Which is most prominent? And remember that even if you don't have imposter syndrome, you probably have one of these, and you probably have noticed it. So I want you to think for about 30 seconds maybe I'll give you about a minute about which one's most prominent. And then I really want you to dig into that for a minute for yourself and think, what would change in your life if you could start to dial that tendency down? Dial it down. Okay, so I'll give you less than a minute to think about that. Okay, so hopefully each of you can kind of think about those tendencies and to think about where they might show up for you. And importantly, to start thinking about a vision of something different. You know, what would it mean for you if you have a really strong inner critic? What would it mean, and how would your life change, and how would your day-to-day change if maybe you could just kind of dial that back a little bit and say, hi, inner critic, nice to see you, go away. And what would that mean for you? And so those are the kinds of things that you can do as you work in imposter syndrome. Those are the kinds of things you can do as you develop some tools and skills to overcome this. So what we're going to do now is really jump into thinking about this and to think about some of the drivers for this internally, but also for thinking about some of the tools and the skills that you can develop for yourself to change things and to make action, to take action. So this is one of it's such a popular quote. It's actually a misquote. Viktor Frankl did not say this. It's not in his book. It's nowhere in his writings, but it's been attributed to him. So he still gets credit for it. And it's a wonderful quote. So we'll just give him credit. So that's where it is. The quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I love this quote, and I love it for imposter syndrome especially, because as I've talked about in the tendencies, and you could probably see that for yourself, many times the 5 tendencies are because the stimulus and the response are so close together that we don't have any space, and we don't allow any space to choose our response, and our response just comes bubbling out of us, whether it's tears when we are criticized, or whether it's our inner critic telling us not to do something and we act and we listen to it, any of those things, is that the space is too small. So in many ways, what I think imposter syndrome work and working towards controlling it is to push the stimulus and the response apart and create more space so that you have room to actually choose. Now, the problem is, and I am not a neuropathologist, so please forgive me, everyone who knows the brain way better than me, please forgive my very, very pathetic oversimplifications of the brain. I was not the good one when I came to neuropathology. So, but I will boil it down and talk a little bit about the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is one of the key actors in the limbic system, and the amygdala is responsible for shrinking that space, right? The amygdala is the one that closes it down and makes the stimulus and the response right next to each other. And I do not want to insult the amygdala. I love my amygdala. It is a very, very useful little organ for me. It takes in information from my environment, and it helps me to see danger and distress, and it gives me quick reactions when there is danger and when there is distress. So when I'm speaking to non-medical audiences, I think it's a great metaphor either way. You know, when you're driving down the road and someone slams on the brakes right in front of you, your amygdala takes your foot from the gas pedal to the brake pedal and slams it on and saves you from a car accident. Thank you, amygdala. We appreciate you. Now, unfortunately, the amygdala is really, really good at what it does, but it's not very accurate at what it does. And so we call this situation when the amygdala over-responds, the amygdala hijack. And the amygdala hijack is real. It happens all the time. I know all of you have experienced this, possibly even this week. I mean, most people experience it regularly. And the reason is because the amygdala misinterprets threats. It's really, really good at seeing a threat, but it's not very accurate. So it will think everything's a threat. And it'll put us into this fight, flight, freeze reaction, even when things are not threats, when they're just normal things, you know, like applying for that fellowship, which put that woman into an amygdala response and pathway that shut it down for her. The other problem with the amygdala is that it's really fast, and it's much, much faster than the thinking brain, than the cerebral cortex, which would process it. And it's that easy, fast pathway that often wins. And then lastly, we're not very good at de-escalating that threat either. So we create these elaborate stories to kind of support the threat. And, you know, this is just absolutely classic, I think. And I don't know about you all, but this is the annual review time for us. So we're going through the annual reviews, and all the faculty are meeting with me. And I see amygdala hijack time after time, person after person, because anytime anything negative is present, people's amygdalas get triggered and hijacked. And then the stories start. And this is a very normal human reaction. And actually, our brains are very powerful at stories. So, and we'll talk a little bit at the very end about stories again. So we get these stories going, and then we kind of go down the path of amygdala hijack, and it's really hard to get off of it. So what we really want to do is push that apart, that stimulus and response apart. And I like to think of this as making and taking space. And this is my memory of living in Boston. I don't know if anyone's lived in Boston before, but I took the red line, one of the T's, and I would get on the train really early at the very first stop. So I would always get a seat. But as the train got closer and closer to the city, it would get fuller and fuller. And it was always remarkable to me that some people would look at this seating arrangement and they would see a space and they would actually squeeze into it and make space in between where those little red slivers are. They would create a space for themselves to sit. And, you know, I as much as it was annoying because they would push you aside and, you know, squeeze in there with these parkas and everything else, as much as it was annoying, it was a really interesting phenomenon because there was self-empowerment in that by saying, I'm going to take that space. There's a little bit of space there and I'm going to take it. And that self-empowerment is something we can learn from, that making and taking space. I'm going to tell you a little story of a couple of years ago where at our weekly chairs meeting where I used to work, it was at 6:30 in the morning, an ungodly time to have a chairs meeting. It was very early. And at one of the meetings, there were 3 women chairs. And at one of the meetings, one of the women said we were talking about gender bias. I don't remember what it was in relationship to. And she said, well, of course, lots of times at this meeting, the men are around the table and the women are around the outside. And the male chairs went ballistic. And they said, absolutely not true. Completely not true. And the women chairs were like, yes, it is. And the men were like, no, it's not. And the men said, well, it just has nothing to do with gender. It's just when you get here. I mean, if you get here first, you sit at the table. And if you don't get here first and there's no more seats, you sit at the outside. And the women were like, yeah, well, I guess that's kind of true. And then over the week after that, I got to thinking about it. And the three women chairs, we all had young children. And I know my morning was getting lunches ready and putting out clothes and making sure the backpack was there, all those things that moms do. And I mean, sure, dad could do it, but I still did it, even as a chair. And I know those other women did too. And so that made me think, well, maybe we are getting there later, and maybe it's because our day is different. And that was interesting. But then what was really interesting was a couple of weeks later, when I got there early and I sat at the table, and one of the male chairs got there late. And you know what happened? He pulled his chair from the outside of the ring and he pulled it up and he asked me to scoot over and make room. And I thought, fascinating. That's what's happening. It's called making and taking space. And that is self-empowerment, right? And we can learn from that. We can learn from that making and taking space. And we can learn from that in terms of self-empowerment. So I'm going to give you a couple of tools now that if you find this interesting, that you can think about for yourself in terms of making and taking space. We're going to talk about it on the physical level, and we're also going to talk about it on the mental level. What this really is interrupting old patterns. So we're going to interrupt the old physiology, and we're going to interrupt the old thought patterns. There is a lot of benefit in self-empowerment. There's benefit in physical self-empowerment. So taking the physical actions that make you empowered, because it does turn out from lots and lots of different studies that the physical body impacts the mindset. Even though we used to think it was the other way around, it's actually bidirectional. So where we place our body, how we place our body, and what we do with our physicality does impact our mindset. The other side is the mental side. And with mental self-empowerment, it will affect your presence. So consciously thinking and behaving like an empowered person is a foundation for that executive presence that makes it so that you can pull your chair up to a table and ask people to make space for you. So let's talk a little bit about the physiology side first. So there's a lot of work on this. Amy Cuddy is the most famous person who has worked on this. And she calls it power posing. And some of her work has been disputed, but a lot of it is based in some really good studies. So I do believe this work, even though some of it has been challenged. Overall, it's good work. So what she says is that assuming a powerful stance creates a powerful person. It is self-empowering to place your body into a powerful stance. And this has to do with posture. Lots of it has to do with posture, but it also has to do with other things like breath control, vocalization, gestures, eye contact. We're going to talk about breath control and posture as two things that you can do to have this physical sense of self-empowerment. So the first tool is breath cycles. And this is like so funny because it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but it's becoming more and more interesting and important to people. We talk about it in mindfulness. People talk about it in yoga. It's talked about in all kinds of areas. But it's also talked about in things like the military. So there's military breathing, which is meant to de-escalate and calm a person in battle. I mean, these are real studies that have shown that the breath control is very, very powerful. So there's lots of different ways to think about this, and I've given you a few here. My favorite one is the balance and coherence breathing cycle because it's so simple. For 1 minute, you breathe in for a count of 5 and you breathe out for a count of 5. Very, very, very simple, but very empowering. And if you would like, after this session, you can just do a minute of that breath control and see what happens. Because I bet you'll notice a difference in your level of emotional self-control, in your level of grounding and centering, and sort of that mindfulness approach. But you don't have to just rely on the feelings. There's actually some really interesting science around this that looks at heart rate variability, which is a really good measure of sympathetic and parasympathetic balance. It's actually used in ICUs and in lots of different settings where it's been shown to heart rate variability coherence, when you're in good coherence between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, has been shown to promote healing, and it's really very powerful. So what coherence looks like is this very nice smooth curve pattern. Not all the bumps are at the same spot, but they're nice and smooth and regular. So this is my own data, by the way. So this is me, and I will tell you what I was doing. So over here, I was doing the breathing cycle of 5 count in and 5 count out. And what I did here is I stopped the breathing and I opened my email and I started looking at it. And guess what happened? Woo! Parasympathetic, sympathetic imbalance everywhere. Here, I kept the email open, but I reestablished the breathing cycle. And what you can see is that I got back into a coherent pattern. So these breath cycles can be very, very powerful. I encourage you to test them out and play with them. Tool number 2 has to do with power posing, which is what Amy Cuddy talks about. And this is really about owning and taking up space. It's about taking up space around you to imply or to feel self-empowerment. So again, this is that posture part of that. And let me just show you this interesting picture. I had some pictures on my phone from a workshop that I did a couple of years ago with our staff. And these were real. So these were the women, and these were a couple of men. And what I want you to notice here is how much space people are taking up. And what I want you to notice is how the women have shrunk themselves into smaller spaces and how the men have expanded themselves into larger spaces. And it's very interesting because this is exactly what power posing shows, that as you take up more space, and you notice I just did that, so I don't know if everybody saw it, but my instinct is like when I start talking about it, I start to move and take up more space, and hopefully you are doing the same thing. So this is really about expanding and taking up 3-dimensional space. And when you do that, it changes your feelings. It changes how you feel. Okay. Now, the last part is mindset of self-empowerment. This is, again, we're not going to get into any detail here, but where I am going to take you is to think about that supersized inner critic you might have. And I want to show you a tool that you can use for changing that inner critic. Now, we're not going to do this self-reflection. I'm just going to show you some of the thoughts and inner critic phrases that people have come up with in all of my sessions. And I'm going to give you just a minute to look at this, just a short minute. And I bet you're going to think of things that come into your brain that are very, very similar to these. So probably all of you resonate with at least one of these. Probably each of you has some little element of that very pervasive and mean inner critic. And that inner critic is all about deficit thinking. It's all about creating negative emotions. It's all about undermining self-confidence. There's an opposite to that, the inner wisdom, and we have that too. It's usually not as pervasive. It's usually harder to find and harder to pull out. And so the last tool for that I want to share with you is really around how to pull out that inner wisdom and how to kind of suppress and push down that inner critic, how to change the story. So stories in our heads are related to that inner critic. They're not real. They're little bits and pieces. They're little selected things that we embellish and that we put meaning back into. Not real stories. And they're very, very, very skewed. We use all of these cognitive distortions, discounting, disasterizing, distorting, divining, to create these crazy stories that our inner critic is telling us. So tool number 3 is really about changing that narrative. It's about changing that story. So this is a fun tool to practice, and it's really interesting. I call it reframing by manifesting gifts. And what this is about is to start recalling and thinking about challenges in your life even today, you can think about, I do this. I think this is a great tool to practice every night, to write down 3 things that didn't go very well for you today. 3 things that were kind of an annoyance, not very good. You had a bad hair day, whatever. And then to reframe it as a potential gift or opportunity. So the other day I got out a little bit late, like I was just 1 minute late leaving in the morning. And I came up to brake lights, and all those brake lights were there. And I was like, oh, darn it. If I'd spent a minute earlier, then I wouldn't be stuck in traffic, until I realized that I was 4 cars from a huge accident. And when I look at that and go, wow, thank goodness I was 1 minute late, because 4 cars away is probably about a minute, right? And I might have been in that accident had I been right on time. So this manifesting gifts is about changing that narrative. So what I want you to think about at the very end here is, what about you? What about you? What can you change? Could you commit to using one of these tools for, every day for 2 weeks, let's just say? Could you start using that purposeful, intentional breath? Could you start using power posing? Just taking up space. Or better yet, do you want to start the reframing challenges to manifest gifts? And I challenge each of you to think about how you can take this and put it into your life, put it into practice. And that would be really where the learning could take root. So with that, I'm going to finish up and just real quick overview of what we did today. And I am happy to take any questions you might have. I really appreciate I don't know that you were attending. I don't know. I hope you were listening and engaging and being part of it. If we were in the same room, it would be way better for me to know, but we'll take it back to the main audience here, and happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. I think we have time for a few questions. We'll go a little bit over, but please unmute yourself and feel free to ask questions.
Hi, Leo here, Jennifer. Thank you for that terrific presentation. And I don't have a question, I have a comment for all the faculty. I strongly encourage you to take this presentation to heart for each of you and each of your careers. I think this is equally important to men as women. And I think there's a lot of seminal messages here that can help guide you in your future. The assistant professors know that we started something a while ago for the independent career development plan to look 3 years out. But I think everybody should be looking at 5 years, 10 years, and what steps along the way do people want to be taking? And I think, Jennifer, you've created a wonderful roadmap for this. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I love that you've illustrated it. It really is for everybody. So thank you for echoing that.
I got another comment on the heart rate matter. Yeah. So without knowing it, I was an experimental test subject because of COVID, and I have a Fitbit. Oh, so throughout the year, starting last March, I noticed at the peaks of the tension, not getting enough sleep, and good old Dr. Yohe was leading the charge on this. I won't blame her for that, but she was actually helping us through the woods. My resting heart rate went up 15%. Through those periods of intense trauma, whatever they were. So I think your comments on the physiological and the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic is it's real.
The wonderful thing is that it's real, but it's also controllable. Like Absolutely. You can practice these skills and the breathing exercises you can practice. You can actually learn to control your heart rate variability in very powerful ways. You got to use it though. You got to choose it. Exactly. Excellent. Well, you all know how to reach me. So if you have questions you don't want to ask out loud, please reach out. I love hearing from people. I love hearing if you want to commit to something, you want to tell me you're committing, I'd love that. If you want to try it and in 2 weeks, tell me how it went, I'd love that too. It's been just
thank you so much.
Thank you.
We had a number of people from throughout the medical school joining us today. Thank you all for joining us. The video will be available on our Pathology link website after tomorrow. All righty. Awesome. Have a good day. Thank you, Dr. Hunt, again.
So good.
Great job.
Thank you.